Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're wandering into the drafty cottages, smoky fireplaces and slightly damp straw mattresses of medieval Europe. So if you're curled up under your blankets right now, maybe with a cup of tea, take a deep breath, get cozy and prepare yourself to feel very thankful you weren't born a 14th century farmhand. Before we start, don't forget to dim your screen if you're using this to fall asleep and, maybe tap that like button and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy these rambling history stories. No pressure, I'll still be here with my monotone voice either way. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it oddly comforting to imagine this sleepy little global village we've built with night owls and insomniacs scattered from Boston to Bangalore. Alright, let's begin our gentle stroll back through time to the endless winters of the Middle Ages. So, imagine this. It's the year 1350, and you're a peasant living in some muddy English village. It's January. The sun sets at 4 p.m, your toes are basically popsicles, and the concept of central heating is still about 6 centuries away. The question is, how on earth did people not freeze to death every single night? Well, the short answer is layers. Lots and lots of layers. And not the nice fleece-lined kind we have now. We're talking scratchy wool, patched up linen, and if you're lucky, a slightly moth-eaten cloak. If you weren't lucky, you basically just wrapped yourself in whatever vaguely fabric-like material you could find. And by the way, if you're picturing peasants with neat wardrobes, stop. Clothes were expensive. You usually had one set of good clothes and one set of work clothes. That was it. Laundry was not a weekly affair, it was more of a once the lice are staging a full rebellion situation. So yes, peasants often just slept in their clothes, not because it was cosy, but because they literally couldn't afford to strip down. Now, what about blankets? Again, not great. Wealthier peasants might have a rough woolen blanket, maybe stuffed with feathers if they were really living the dream. But for most, it was straw. Straw mattresses, straw mats, straw stuffed into sacks. And yes, straw was surprisingly good at trapping heat, at least for the first few weeks, until it got damp, mouldy and home to about 7 different kinds of insects. Very hygge. Let's float over for a second to the fire situation. The hearth was the heart of the peasant household, but it wasn't like you could keep it roaring all night. Wood had to be gathered or bought, and peasants didn't exactly have the luxury of wasting fuel while they slept. So what did they do? They banked the fire. Basically, they buried the glowing embers under a heap of ash before bed. This kept the coals smouldering through the night, so in the morning they could be raked back to life without starting from scratch. Think of it as medieval sleep mode. But of course the fire was usually in the main room, and medieval houses weren't insulated. We're talking walls of wattle and daub, basically mud plastered onto sticks. The wind slipped right through. There were gaps in the roof, cracks in the shutters, and occasionally entire missing planks. So unless you were curled up almost directly in the fireplace, you were going to be cold. And that's where the real secret comes in. People slept together. A lot. Families piled into one bed, sometimes with extended family, sometimes even with visitors. The idea of everyone having their own mattress is a modern luxury. In the Middle Ages, bed sharing was survival. It was the original human hot water bottle technique. If you were poor, you kept warm by sleeping body to body. Not very romantic, but very effective. And no, privacy was not really a thing. Parents, children, even servants sometimes piled in. So if you've ever complained about your partner hogging the covers, just be grateful you weren't wedged between your grandmother and 3 siblings while the dog licked your feet for warmth. Speaking of dogs, yes, animals came inside too. In fact, in many peasant households, the animals were the central heating. Chickens, pigs, goats, they often shared the same space as humans. Partly for security, partly because building a whole separate barn was too much effort, and partly because pigs are basically portable radiators. Picture yourself drifting off to sleep to the sound of your cow chewing cud in the corner. That was life. Now, let's glide over to the question of food, because staying warm wasn't just about blankets and beds, it was about calories. Medieval peasants worked outside in bitter weather, and their bodies needed serious fuel to keep functioning. Diets were heavy in bread, porridge, and whatever root vegetables could be stored through winter. Think turnips, cabbage, onions, the occasional dried fish if you lived near the coast. And yes, beer. A lot of beer. Because beer wasn't just for fun, it was safer than water and full of carbs. A nice little internal radiator. Children drank it, old folks drank it, everybody drank it. The idea of dry January would have made them laugh while they froze. Interestingly, peasants also believed certain foods could literally create warmth. Spices were thought to heat the body. Unfortunately, peasants rarely had access to expensive imports like cinnamon or cloves. But garlic, onions and leeks were common, and these were considered warming foods. So picture a household gathered around a steaming pot of leek pottage, pretending it's basically medieval chili. Let's take a gentle step over to the medical advice of the day. Because of course, medieval doctors had opinions about surviving the cold. According to humoral theory, the idea that the body was ruled by 4 fluids, you needed to keep your internal balance in check. Winter was a cold and wet season, so the advice was to eat hot and dry foods, which mostly meant more garlic, onions, and maybe some mustard seeds if you could find them. Some medieval texts also recommended rubbing fat or oil on your skin before bed. Animal fat, preferably. Not exactly a spa treatment, but surprisingly effective at sealing in body heat. It's the medieval version of Vaseline. And let's not forget the mental side of things. Winters were long, dark, and honestly depressing. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't a diagnosed condition, but peasants absolutely felt it. One way they coped was through community. Winter evenings were often for storytelling, singing, and religious rituals. Gather everyone into the smoky hut, keep the fire embers glowing, and distract yourself from the fact that your nose is still cold. Now, here's something fun to drift on. Bed bugs. Yes, bed bugs were a thing, even in straw mattresses, and fleas, and lice. Basically, if you survived the cold, the insects were waiting to keep you company. So while we imagine peasants snuggling for warmth, it was probably less cosy bedtime scene and more itchy group suffering. But hey, they made it work. We'll keep gliding deeper into this medieval night in the next section. Because honestly, there are still more tricks peasants used, more strange beliefs they clung to, and more weird little details about sleeping arrangements that'll make you either laugh or scratch your head. So settle back down, adjust your blankets, and let's keep moving quietly through the cold medieval dark. Alright, let's shuffle back into the cold. We've covered the basics of layering, bed sharing, and pigs as space heaters, but the medieval night had even more quirks. Because if you think people just went to bed when it got dark, well, technically yes, but also not really. See, medieval sleep wasn't one long 8-hour block, it was often segmented sleep. People drifted off early in the evening, woke up around midnight, then dozed again until dawn. That first phase was called first sleep. The midnight wake-up was often used for things like praying, stoking the fire, or, if you had the energy, other activities. And then came second sleep. Historians found all sorts of references to this pattern, and honestly, it makes sense. Houses were cold, fires needed tending, and your bladder doesn't care if it's the 14th century. And yes, going outside in the middle of the night in January, not fun, which is why many cottages kept a chamber pot. Romantic, I know. Nothing like sharing a bed with 5 people and a bucket of urine in the corner. Sleep tight. Now, let's float over to the architecture side. Peasant houses weren't built for warmth. At best you had a single-room cottage, sometimes with a loft. The walls were wattle and daub, the roof was thatch, and the windows, if they existed at all, were covered with wooden shutters. Glass? Forget it. Even nobles struggled to afford that luxury. Shutters kept out the wind, sort of, but they also kept out light. Which is fine, because candles were expensive and most peasants weren't about to burn one just to trip over a pig in the dark. Inside, the main source of heat was the open hearth. Chimneys weren't common until later in the Middle Ages, so the smoke just drifted out through a hole in the roof, or didn't, meaning the house was smoky, which was terrible for your lungs but pretty good for killing insects in the thatch. A win-win, kind of. Some slightly wealthier peasants might have had a second floor or a loft space above the fire. Warm air rises, so sleeping up there was actually better. Of course, better is relative. It was still drafty, smoky and uncomfortable, but slightly less likely to kill you with frostbite. Let's pause on bedding for a moment because that's where things get interesting. We mentioned straw mattresses earlier, but there was actually a whole hierarchy of sleep surfaces. Poor peasants had straw on the floor, maybe covered with an old blanket if they were lucky. Slightly better off peasants stuffed straw into a tick, a rough linen sack. And the wealthy, well, they had feather beds, which sounds luxurious, until you realise feathers tend to poke through the fabric and stab you in the face all night. There's even an old saying, good straw keeps a peasant warm, but bad straw is worse than the bare floor. Meaning if your straw was damp or mouldy, you'd be better off just sleeping on the dirt. And honestly, they weren't wrong. For covering, wool blankets were the gold standard. Linen sheets existed, but for peasants they were rare luxuries. Many people simply wrapped themselves in their cloaks. And yes, cloaks doubled as blankets. It wasn't just a fashion statement. Imagine falling asleep still wearing your muddy work clothes, with your only cloak pulled tight around you. That was pretty normal. Now, let's wander over to the communal aspect again, because this was key. Families weren't just sharing beds for warmth, they were also cramming into small houses for survival. The more bodies in a room, the warmer it got. Which means medieval peasants basically relied on the same principle as penguins, the huddle method. Except instead of cute penguins, it was your smelly cousin and maybe the neighbour's goat. Privacy, of course, didn't exist. If you were newly married and wanted some, shall we say, private time, good luck. You either made do with everyone in the same room, or you waited for a rare moment when the house was empty. Which explains a lot about why medieval people were obsessed with saints and confession. Imagine your in-laws and 5 siblings snoring 3 feet away while you're trying to start a dynasty. It takes patience. Now, nobles and royalty, let's compare just for fun. Because while peasants were huddled in smoky huts, nobles weren't exactly cosy either. Castles were stone refrigerators. Thick walls trapped the cold. Windows were larger, which meant more drafts. And while they had tapestries, feather beds, and actual fireplaces in bedrooms, it was still freezing. There are accounts of water freezing in jugs inside noble chambers. So yes, the luxury of being rich still meant shivering under 5 layers of blankets while rats scurried across the rushes on the floor. But here's the kicker. At least nobles had servants to warm the fin. Literally. Bed warmers were metal pans filled with hot coals slid between the sheets to take the edge off before the law climbed in. Some unlucky servants probably had to hop into the bed first to warm it up with their body. Peasants had no such luxury. Their bed warmer was the family dog. Let's talk superstition for a bit. Because medieval people didn't just think about warmth in practical terms, they also had some, let's say, creative beliefs about cold. Many thought drafts were dangerous, literally life-threatening. The idea of bad air causing illness was everywhere. So peasants often stuffed rags or straw into cracks in the walls, not just for warmth, but to keep out evil vapours. Because obviously, what's worse than freezing to death? Being possessed by a cold demon. There were also plenty of charms and folk remedies. Some believed carrying a bit of iron kept you warm, since iron was strong. Others swore by wool socks blessed on certain feast days. Did it work? Probably not. But if you're trudging through a muddy field in February, you'll cling to any hope. Let's glide over now to the rhythms of the year, because winter wasn't just about surviving nights, it shaped the entire cycle of peasant life. During the growing season, people worked from dawn to dusk, but in winter, days were shorter and there was less to do in the fields. So evenings were long, dark and cold. Families told stories, mended clothes and maybe did small crafts. Spinning wool, carving tools, making nets. Things you could do indoors. And of course, religion played a role. Winter was filled with feast days, saints' days and community gatherings. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas. These weren't just religious observances, they were social ones. They broke up the monotony of long, cold nights, and yes, they usually involved food, drink, and huddling together for warmth. Now, a fun little aside, candles. We take light for granted, but medieval peasants didn't. Candles were expensive, beeswax was reserved for churches. Ordinary people used tallow candles, made from animal fat. These smoked, smelled bad, and burned quickly. So most peasants went to bed soon after dark, because why waste fuel? Nights were long, but you weren't sitting up reading. Unless you really like the smell of burning cow fat. Let's not forget the body itself, people adapted. If you grew up in a freezing hut, your tolerance was higher. Thick woolen socks, heavy cloaks, lots of movement, your body adjusted. But still, frostbite, chilblains, and respiratory illness were common. Many children didn't survive harsh winters, and yet somehow villages kept going. And that's maybe the strangest part to modern ears. Medieval peasants didn't see winter as unusual. They didn't complain about it the way we do when the Wi-Fi goes out. Cold was life. Freezing nights were part of the rhythm of existence. You slept with your family, with your animals, under scratchy blankets, on a straw bed in a smoky room, and in the morning you got up, ate porridge, and went back to work. One last odd little thing to drift on tonight: shoes, or rather, the lack of them. Many peasants had only one pair, and they were worn until they disintegrated. So in winter, people often went barefoot indoors. Even in the cold, shoes were for outside. Inside, you just lived with cold feet. Socks were rare, usually just wrapped cloth. So yes, peasants basically invented the cold tile bathroom floor experience. Only theirs was the entire house. And with that, we can quietly step into another angle: how different regions dealt with the cold. Because not all medieval winters were equal. Some villages in southern Europe had milder seasons, while northern Europe faced brutal freezes. The strategies shifted accordingly. But we'll drift into that gently in the next part. So, pull your blanket a little tighter, take a slow breath, and let's prepare to wander further through this cold medieval night. So, we've got our peasants huddled under scratchy blankets, tucked in with grandma, 3 siblings, and a pig for warmth. But not all medieval cold was created equal. Let's drift north and south for a moment, because geography played a big role in how miserable your winter nights could be. In southern Europe, say Spain or Italy, winters were milder. Nights were chilly, sure, but nothing like northern France or Scandinavia. A Tuscan peasant might have slept under one wool blanket and been fine. Meanwhile, in Norway, people were basically living in a frozen tundra. Wooden houses there were sturdier, often with turf roofs to keep heat in. And yet, it was still freezing. Let's just say Viking blood wasn't an actual heating system, though people liked to act like it was. In the Alps, peasants often herded their animals into the ground floor of their houses. The animals lived below, people slept above. The rising body heat from the cows actually warmed the living quarters, which, to be fair, was clever, and slightly smelly. But hey, it worked. Now, let's drift into one of my favourite weird details: medieval nightcaps. Yes, they really wore those floppy hats you see in old illustrations. And no, it wasn't just a fashion statement. Houses were so drafty that people literally needed to cover their heads in bed. Heat escapes fastest from the head, so peasants wore wool caps or even just tied cloths around their skulls. That stereotypical Scrooge in a nightcap image? Totally legit. And if you were really poor, you might just pull your cloak hood over your face. Which sounds suffocating, but apparently it was a cozy enough solution. Picture a whole family lined up in bed, all with their hoods pulled tight, like a row of cold medieval burritos. Let's talk about sleep habits again, because medieval nights were long, really long. In northern Europe, winter nights could stretch 14 to 16 hours, which left a lot of time to fill. Remember that first sleep and second sleep thing? During that wakeful gap in the middle of the night, peasants sometimes did chores. They might check on animals, mend tools, or, if they were literate, which most weren't, say prayers from a book. But mostly it was talking, whispering, or, trying to ignore the snoring from everyone else in the bed. This segmented sleep rhythm wasn't unique to Europe. It showed up all over the world before artificial light. Humans are naturally wired to break the night into chunks, but for peasants it was just practical. Fires needed tending, children needed quieting, chamber pots needed emptying. All very glamorous. Now, drifting over to health for a bit. Winter was hard on the body. Cold, damp houses meant coughs and lung infections were common. Winter diseases, as they were called, swept through villages. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, they hit hard, and peasants had basically no way to treat them. The local cure might involve herbal teas, garlic poultices, or bloodletting, because of course it did. Doctors, if you could afford one, believed cold air upset the humours, so the advice was often things like avoid drafts, eat warming foods, and don't overexert, which is hilarious when your entire job was trudging through snow to haul wood. There are even records of peasants stuffing their ears with wool to block the cold. Not a bad idea, actually, though it probably didn't help much when the roof leaked icy rainwater directly onto your mattress. Let's glide to the church for a moment, because religion and cold nights were deeply linked. Churches were usually the only stone buildings in a village, and while they were drafty too, they sometimes doubled as community shelters in extreme cold. During famines or brutal winters, peasants might huddle in the church overnight. Not exactly toasty, but better than dying in the fields. Monks, by the way, had their own struggles. Monastic dormitories were cold stone halls. Monks slept in rows, often fully dressed, sometimes even in their shoes. Imagine chanting prayers at 3 a.m. while your breath is fogging in the air. Holiness didn't come with central heating. Now, nobles again. Because I know some of you like comparing peasant misery with royal misery. We already said castles were stone ice boxes, but nobles had one advantage: fabrics, lots of fabrics. Bed curtains were a big deal. Noble beds were often surrounded by heavy curtains to keep out drafts. Picture a 4-poster bed draped in tapestries. Inside, it was significantly warmer. Outside, freezing. Servants slept on the floor wrapped in cloaks, while their lord was snug in his little fabric cocoon. And nobles could afford fur. Rabbit, fox, ermine, fur cloaks and blankets were prized for warmth. Peasants? They were lucky if they had sheepskin, and even that usually went to the more well-off farmers. So while nobles complained about cold chambers, they were still much warmer than the guy sleeping next to his goat. Here's something odd but worth floating on. Sleep and superstition. Many peasants believed spirits and demons roamed at night, especially in the dark of winter, which meant leaving a fire smouldering wasn't just about warmth, it was protection. Light kept away evil, or so they thought. Families sometimes left candles or embers glowing to guard them, which of course was also a massive fire hazard in a house made of sticks and straw. But details. Dreams were also taken seriously. Long, cold nights meant long, vivid dreams, and peasants often interpreted them as omens. A dream of warmth might mean good fortune. A dream of ice might predict famine. Of course, dreams were also influenced by the fact you were literally freezing. But in the medieval mind, everything was symbolic. Now, let's not forget about alcohol again. Beer, yes, but also ale and mead. These drinks weren't just for fun, they provided warmth and calories. A warm buzz on a cold night was probably the closest thing to central heating peasants had. And yes, children drank too. It was normal. The water wasn't safe, so alcohol was the go-to. Imagine a medieval toddler sipping weak ale before bed. Probably explains a lot about medieval decision-making. Here's a slightly grosser detail. Vermin. Cold nights drove rats and mice indoors. Houses weren't sealed, so animals wandered in freely. Cats were useful, but not every household had one. Some relied on dogs, others just coexisted with rodents. If you've ever tried falling asleep while a mouse scratches in the wall, imagine that, but with no exterminator to call. Just endless squeaks. Lovely. Okay, let's zoom back to the bigger picture. Cold wasn't just about individual nights, it shaped the entire culture. Villages planned their year around winter survival. Grain had to be harvested and stored, firewood gathered, animals sheltered. The success of your preparations determined how miserable or fatal your nights would be. If you ran out of wood or food, you were in serious trouble, and many did. Winter mortality rates were high, especially for children and the elderly. Famines often hit hardest in late winter and early spring, the hungry gap when last year's stores were gone and new crops weren't ready. Those were the nights when peasants went to bed not just cold but hungry. And that's a double misery you probably don't want to imagine too vividly while you're trying to fall asleep. Let's soften things again by drifting into folklore. Winter nights were story nights. Families gathered around the embers and told tales, fairy stories, saints as legends, local gossip. It kept spirits up, literally and figuratively. Many of the folk tales we know today, wolves, witches, haunted forests, were shaped by those long dark winters. Peasants passed the time by spinning yarns, both literally and metaphorically. And in that sense, winter wasn't just hardship, it was also community. People bonded in the cold. You didn't survive alone. You survived as a household, a village, a cluster of humans and animals packed together against the dark. Which, in a weird way, is kind of comforting. So let's take a breath here. Picture a smoky little cottage, straw on the floor, a faint glow from the hearth. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, a family snores in a tangle of limbs, while chickens roost in the rafters and a pig shifts in its pen. It's not glamorous. It's not romantic. But it was life. And for millions of peasants across medieval Europe, it was the only way to survive the coldest nights. We'll wander even further into this winter world in the next part, looking at how holidays, festivals, and even clothing innovations shaped the medieval battle with the cold. So, pull your blanket a little tighter, sip your drink, and let's keep drifting together. So far, we've got peasants huddling with their animals, nobles shivering in drafty stone castles, and everyone basically inventing the sleeping bag by accident. But winter wasn't all gloom. It also shaped traditions, festivals, and the way people related to each other. Cold nights, in a strange way, built medieval culture. Let's start with holidays, because if you're going to freeze half the year, you might as well throw a party while you do it. Winter was packed with feast days. Christmas, of course, was the big one, but it wasn't the cosy, commercialised holiday we know today. For medieval peasants, Christmas was one of the rare times they actually ate well. Lords sometimes gave tenants extra food or ale, and villagers came together for communal meals. Imagine trudging through the snow all year, and then finally getting to roast a pig and eat until you forgot how cold you were. There was also the Feast of Epiphany in January, and Candlemas in February. These weren't just about religion. They were excuses for warmth. Fires, candles, food, drink, and company. The dark wasn't quite so dark when everyone was singing and drinking together. Clothing is another fun one to drift on. We already said wool was king, but how people layered it is worth exploring. Underclothes were usually linen. Yes, even for peasants, if they could manage it. Over that went a wool tunic. Then a cloak. Cloaks were basically the medieval version of a winter coat. Thick, heavy, pinned at the shoulder, and worn indoors as much as outdoors. And if you were extra cold, you didn't take it off in bed. It was your portable blanket. Socks as we know them didn't really exist. People wrapped their legs in woolen bands called puttees or leg wraps, sort of like DIY socks. Shoes were leather, thin and not insulated, which meant your feet were almost always cold. So medieval advice often included warming your feet by the fire before bed. Revolutionary stuff. Hats, though, were essential. We already talked about nightcaps, but by day peasants wore simple wool hoods. They looked a bit silly, but they worked. The hood extended into a cape-like shoulder cover, so it kept the neck and the upper body warm too. In a world without heated scarves from Amazon, it was a lifesaver. Let's float over to family life, because the cold shaped how people interacted. Picture this. A single-room house, smoky, noisy, filled with the people and animals. Winter nights forced intimacy. Families were literally stacked together. Privacy was non-existent. Children grew up watching and hearing everything, because where else were they going to go? On one hand, this closeness created strong bonds. Families told stories together, prayed together, and physically kept each other alive. On the other hand, well, let's just say tensions flared. Imagine being trapped indoors for weeks with your entire family, a few neighbours, and some livestock. Cabin fever existed long before log cabins, and this, by the way, may be why medieval records show so many petty disputes in winter. Court rolls are full of cases of neighbours bickering about firewood, boundaries, or animals wandering. When everyone's cold and cranky, arguments happen. Speaking of animals again, their role can't be overstated. We've already said pigs and cows doubled as heaters, but there was another reason peasants kept them close: predators. Wolves were a real danger in medieval Europe. Winter drove them near villages, desperate for food. Keeping animals indoors at night wasn't just for warmth, it was protection. So if you were snuggled under your cloak, listening to your cow farting gently in the corner, at least you could be thankful it wasn't being eaten by a wolf. Now, let's talk about the smell, because honestly, a medieval winter night didn't smell like cinnamon candles. Straw bedding, unwashed bodies, smoke, chambered pots and livestock, it was an olfactory nightmare. But here's the thing, people didn't notice. When everyone smells, no one does. Their noses were used to it, which is good, because no amount of lavender sachets was fixing that. Alright, drifting to medical practices again. We've covered humours and garlic poultices, but some medieval warmth hacks were surprisingly clever. For instance, hot stones. People heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth and put them in bed to warm it. It's basically the ancestor of the hot water bottle, except it sometimes scorched your sheets, but hey, it worked. Another trick was layering straw or rushes on the floor. It didn't just keep feet from freezing, it also provided insulation. In castles, nobles replaced rushes on the floor regularly. In peasant huts, they didn't, which meant the rushes built up with dirt, food scraps and animal waste until they were basically compost. Cozy. Religion again, because you can't escape it in the Middle Ages. People genuinely believed suffering through cold was spiritually meaningful. Endurance was a form of piety. Saints' lives are full of stories of holy men and women surviving winters with nothing but faith and maybe a ragged cloak. Ordinary peasants couldn't choose their suffering, but they could at least frame it as godly, which probably helped them cope. Let's slide over to the psychology of it. We modern folks panic if the Wi-Fi cuts out for 10 minutes. Medieval peasants endured 6 months of long, dark nights without complaint. They expected it. Cold was normal, which oddly enough probably made it easier. If you're raised in a freezing hut, you don't fantasize about central heating. You just do what everyone else does. Pile on clothes, huddle with your family, and hope spring comes soon. And now, a funny little aside, dreams of summer. Medieval poetry and songs often described longing for warm days, green fields and sunshine. It wasn't just artistic, it was survival. Singing about mayflowers while your nose froze off in January was a form of mental escape, which honestly isn't so different from us scrolling tropical vacation reels in February. Nobles again? Because why not compare misery? In castles, bed sharing was common too, not always with family, but with servants or companions. A nobleman might sleep in a big bed with his squire nearby. Queens often shared with ladies in waiting. This wasn't just warmth, it was also status. Being close enough to share a bed with royalty was a sign of trust. Imagine telling people, yes, I'm cold at night, but at least I get to be cold next to the king. Let's end this part with a little vignette to picture. It's January somewhere in France, the year 1300. A peasant family lies crammed together on a straw bed. The father snores, the children twitch in their sleep. The mother whispers a prayer for the crops. A pot of embers glows faintly in the hearth, throwing smoke into the rafters where chickens shift and mutter. Outside the wind howls. Inside it smells of damp wool and animals. No one is comfortable, but everyone is alive. And that was enough. We'll drift even deeper in the next part, into how villages prepared for winter months, what happened when preparations failed, and how entire communities handled cold seasons together. So pull your blanket closer, maybe sip your tea, and let's keep wandering through the endless medieval night. So far, we've had peasants piling into beds with pigs, nobles hiding in the fabric cocoons, and monks chanting through the cold. But winter wasn't just about shivering through the night. It was also about surviving the season as a whole, and that meant preparation, or in many cases, lack of preparation. Let's start with food stores, because if you ran out in January, good luck making it to spring. Peasants spent autumn frantically harvesting and storing whatever they could. Grains went into sacks, beans into jars, root vegetables into cellars. Meat was salted, smoked or dried. Cheese was aged, ale was brewed. Everything revolved around getting enough calories to make it through. But here's the catch. Medieval preservation wasn't perfect. Grain could rot, meat could spoil, rats and mice could eat half your stores while you slept. And when supplies ran low, peasants entered what was grimly known as the Hungry Gap. This was late winter to early spring, when last year's food was gone and new crops weren't ready. These were the hardest nights. You weren't just cold, you were hungry too. Now, let's drift into famine winters. Because yes, they happened. Crop failures, floods, or disease could wipe out harvests. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is a good example. Rain ruined crops across Europe, cattle died of disease, food prices skyrocketed, and people starved. Chroniclers wrote of peasants eating cats, dogs, even bark from trees. Villages shrank, children died, and all of it happened while the nights were freezing cold. So if you're tucked up with a snack right now, maybe take a bite in honour of the medieval peasant, who would have sold his soul for a piece of stale bread. Now, let's slide over to community survival strategies. Villages weren't just random collections of huts. They were support systems. Neighbours shared resources when possible. If one family had extra firewood, another might have extra grain. Sometimes lords provided relief, though, not out of kindness. Dead peasants don't pay rent. But often, it was just families leaning on each other. Winter was communal by necessity. Festivals helped too. We've already talked about Christmas and Candlemas, but there were smaller local feasts, often tied to saints' days that broke up the monotony. Even if you were hungry, you still gathered, sang, and maybe had a sip of ale together. Human warmth went a long way when the hearth wasn't enough. Now, folk remedies. Because when you're desperate, you'll try anything. Some believed tying herbs into your clothes kept you warm. Others swore by charms, bits of iron, holy medals, or even animal bones. One odd recommendation was to sleep with onions under your pillow, which supposedly drove away chills. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it made your bed smell like soup, which was probably comforting. There were also sayings like, keep your stomach full and your feet warm. Good advice, except peasants rarely managed either. Still, wrapping your feet in cloth and sitting as close to the fire as possible was the medieval equivalent of turn up the thermostat. And then, of course, there were the desperate measures. In lean years, peasants thinned their porridge with more water, stretched bread with ground-up acorns, or boiled weeds for soup. Nights in those winters weren't just cold, they were miserable. Imagine lying on damp straw, stomach growling, smoke stinging your eyes, while your neighbour's cow snored. Sleep didn't come easy. Let's not forget children here. Medieval kids didn't get special treatment. They shared the same cold beds, the same meagre blankets. Infant mortality spiked in winter. Babies simply couldn't handle the chill. Parents swaddled them tightly in cloth, kept them close to the fire, or tucked them into the middle of the family bed. But even then, many didn't make it through their first winter. A grim lullaby, but very real. Shall we drift to architecture again? Because villages did adapt. In colder regions, houses were sometimes partially sunken into the ground. Earth walls provided insulation. Turf roofs were common in Scandinavia and the British Isles. They weren't pretty, but they kept heat in. Smoke-filled, yes, but warmer. And when your choices are warm and smoky, or freezing and breathable, you pick smoky. Every time. Some villages even had communal ovens or bake houses. These stayed warm long after bread was baked, so people sometimes gathered there to chat, work, or just absorb a little extra heat. Picture the medieval equivalent of crowding into a coffee shop for Wi-Fi, except it's for warmth. And the latte is just a loaf of rye bread. Now, nobles again, because why not rub it in? They had larger stores of food, of course. Their cellars held wine, salted meat, barrels of ale. But nobles weren't immune to famine. If crops failed, even their supplies ran low. And remember, castles were colder than huts. Peasants at least had body heat and smoke. Castles had vast stone halls, icy drafts, and fireplaces that looked dramatic but only heated the person standing directly in front of them. So nobles stuffed themselves with rich food, wore fur, and huddled behind curtains. Peasants made do with garlic, onions, and each other. Both were miserable, just in different flavours. Here's a little oddity. Some people slept in shifts. If the house was very small and crowded, not everyone had space to lie down at once, so some stood, sat, or dozed by the fire while others slept. Then they swapped. We think of bedtime as universal, but for medieval peasants it was often negotiated chaos. Now, I want you to picture the sounds of a medieval winter night. Not silence, never silence. There was the crackle of the fire, the shuffle of animals, the snoring of family, the scratching of rats, the wind in the thatch, the drip of water through the roof, and the occasional distant howl of a wolf. It was a full orchestra of discomfort, and somehow people managed to drift off to sleep in the middle of it, which honestly is impressive. Let's drift for a moment into the idea of resilience, because as bleak as this all sounds, peasants did survive. Not all, but many. Generation after generation they endured cold nights, hungry winters, smoky huts, and endless drafts. And they didn't just endure, they built communities, told stories, had families, and kept going. That stubborn endurance is maybe the most fascinating part. Now, to balance the bleakness, let's talk about laughter. Because yes, even in the freezing dark, people joked. Medieval humour was often crude, but it kept spirits alive. Families teased each other, made light of hardships, and probably joked about who snored the loudest. Humour was warmth, and in a hut that cold, every bit of warmth mattered. So picture again our January peasant family. Their food stores are low, their fire smoulders, their cloaks are wrapped tight. They lie together, half asleep, dreaming of spring. Outside, the village is silent under snow. Inside, life persists, because somehow, against all odds, it always did. And in the next part, we'll drift into the longer legacy of medieval cold, how these winters shaped agriculture, family size, even folklore. And yes, we'll peek at how climate shifts like the Little Ice Age made everything worse. So, take another breath, adjust your blank, and let's keep floating through the medieval night. So far we've stayed mostly inside the smoky huts and drafty castles, but now it's time to zoom out a little, because the medieval climate itself deserves a moment. Winters weren't all the same across the centuries. Some were brutal, some were mild, and then, beginning in the late Middle Ages, came what historians call the Little Ice Age. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Don't picture glaciers swallowing villages. That's not what happened. The Little Ice Age was more of a long chill stretching from roughly the 14th to the 19th century. Temperatures dropped a few degrees on average, but that small shift made winters harsher, growing seasons shorter, and famines more common, and peasants already living on the edge suffered most. Let's drift into some examples. Around the 1300s, Europe's climate began to cool. Crops that had once grown fine suddenly struggled. Wheat failed more often. Grapes refused to ripen in northern vineyards. Fishing became unpredictable as sea ice expanded, and winters dragged on. That meant longer cold nights, thinner food stores, and more sickness. One of the most infamous events during this cooling period was, yes, we're back to it, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. We already touched on it, but let's picture it more clearly. Rains ruined harvests year after year. Villages were soaked and cold. Grain rotted in the fields. Bread prices skyrocketed. People slaughtered draft animals for food, which meant fewer ploughs for the next season. Families dug up roots, boiled weeds, even stripped bark from trees. Cold, wet, hungry nights became the norm, and many didn't survive them. But famine winters weren't just about food, they changed the rhythm of life. If you had less to eat, your body produced less heat. Cold bit harder. Fat reserves dwindled. People lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Diseases spread more easily, and when hunger and cold combined, mortality soared. Imagine lying on your straw bed, stomach empty, covered in one rough blanket, while frost crept along the inside of the shutters. That's the Little Ice Age experience, Peasant Edition. Now here's the thing, not every winter was catastrophic. Some were just long, and peasants adapted in small ways. They bred animals for hardiness, they shifted to hardier grains like rye and oats, which tolerated cold better than wheat. They dug deeper cellars, hoarded more root vegetables, and, in some cases, migrated to warmer regions. Entire villages sometimes relocated. Not far, but far enough to find slightly better conditions. Let's float for a moment to how this climate shift shaped folklore. Cold nights gave birth to legends of winter spirits, frost demons, and witches. If your cow froze or your child got sick, it was easier to blame an otherworldly force than the weather. Many villages had tales of women who could steal warmth, or spirits that sapped your strength in the night. These stories weren't just spooky, they were ways of explaining misery, and maybe, in a strange way, they made peasants feel less alone. After all, if a demon was responsible, at least it wasn't just your bad luck. Now, nobles again. Because while peasants were freezing in their huts, nobles were freezing in bigger rooms. The Little Ice Age hit them too, though they had better food and more blankets. Castles became colder than ever. Stone walls held in the chill. Tapestries did their best. And courtyards filled with snow. Hunting, a noble pastime, became harder. Vineyards failed. Even kings grumbled. In fact, there are records of royal banquets being held in halls so cold that diners kept their cloaks on and fires blazed in giant hearths. So if while peasants starved, nobles at least ate well, but they still shivered while doing it. A royal nose dripping at dinner was not unusual. Now, step quietly into the psychological side again. Cold-shaped patience. Peasants didn't plan in weeks or months. They thought in seasons. Winter was endurance. You endured hunger, endured cold, endured boredom. And that endurance became cultural. Songs, prayers, superstitions, and even lullabies reminded people that spring always came eventually. Nights were endless, but not truly infinite. That promise was all they had to cling to. Here's another oddity, indoor work. We often think of peasants as purely agricultural, but winters forced them to pivot. When fields froze, people spun wool, wove cloth, carved tools, or repaired equipment. These were quiet tasks done by the hearth. Entire families joined in, which meant long evenings of half work, half gossip. It wasn't glamorous, but it passed the time, and passing time when the sun set at 4 p.m. was half the battle. Let's pause on light again. Because during the Little Ice Age, nights weren't just colder, they felt longer. With cloudier skies and storms, moonlight and starlight were often hidden. Villages sat in near total darkness, which meant even a single candle or fire became precious. That tiny glow in the hut wasn't just heat, it was hope. And when the embers burned too low, families stirred and prayed for morning. Animals again, because we can't resist them. Winters were hard on livestock too, cows grew thin. Chickens stopped laying. Pigs were slaughtered in autumn, precisely so they wouldn't need feeding in winter. That's why winter feasts often included pork. It was the last fresh meat of the year. After that you were left with salted, dried or smoked meat, which, yes, peasants sometimes softened by boiling it into oblivion. Imagine a pot of greyish, over-salted pork stew, eaten in the dark while snow piled outside. Comfort food, medieval style. And let's not forget about water. Wells sometimes froze, Rivers iced over. That meant hauling water was miserable and sometimes impossible. Snow could be melted, of course, but that meant extra work. And in huts where smoke already filled the air, boiling snow just made the atmosphere heavier. Still, people did it, because thirst doesn't care if it's January. Now, let's float briefly into medicine again, because Little Ice Age doctors doubled down on humoral theory. They insisted people eat warming foods, avoid cold air, and, if all else failed, bleed out the bad humours. Because obviously, losing blood when you're already starving and cold was the best solution, and yet, people trusted them. Which makes sense, because what else were they going to do? Google frostbite remedies. Shall we wander to monasteries again? Monks endured the Little Ice Age with grim piety. Their dormitories were freezing. Their prayers, scheduled through the night, dragged them from thin blankets into icy chapels. Chroniclers sometimes mention monks' ink freezing in their inkwells. Imagine trying to copy scripture when your fingers are too stiff to hold the quill. Holiness met frostbite, and yet they carried on. Let's soften again with festivals, because even in colder centuries, people still found joy. Ice fairs became common in Northern Europe. Rivers froze solid enough to hold markets. People skated, danced, and sold goods directly on the ice. For peasants, these fairs were rare delights, moments when cold turned festive instead of cruel. A frozen river became not just an obstacle, but a playground. And finally, let's picture again the medieval winter night, this time during the Little Ice Age. A hut smaller than your living room, smoke swirling, straw mats piled high, a family huddled together. Outside, snow buries the fields. Wolves prowl. The wind cuts through every gap. But inside there's a dim glow, a faint warmth, and the stubborn determination to see spring again. That determination, more than wool or fire or pig, was what kept them alive. And with that, we can drift onward, because in the next part, we'll explore how winter survival shaped long-term peasant culture, from marriage patterns to birth rates, and how cold seasons created some surprisingly practical innovations. So, adjust your blanket, take another slow breath, and let's keep gliding. So, wander. We've wandered through smoky huts, freezing castles, and even a mini climate crisis. But cold nights didn't just shape how peasants slept. They shaped how they lived, how they married, and even when they decided to have children. Because in the Middle Ages, winter wasn't just a season, it was a scheduling device. Let's start with marriage. Winter was actually a popular time for weddings. Why? For one thing, the harvest was done, families had more time, and sometimes there was still enough food left from autumn to throw a halfway decent feast. Plus, having everyone trapped indoors meant the whole village could attend without pretending they had better things to do. But there was also a practical reason. Weddings in winter often meant births in autumn, which, from a survival standpoint, was ideal. A baby born in autumn had the best chance of living through its first cold season, old enough to be strong, but not so young that winter's chill would kill it outright. In other words, medieval family planning wasn't about romance, it was about survival statistics. Now, let's drift into childbirth itself, because winter nights were especially dangerous for mothers and infants. Cold made infection more likely. Fires in cottages were small and midwives had to work by smoky light. Imagine giving birth in a hut where the floor was mud, the air was freezing, and the only heating was a pot of embers in the corner. Not exactly the comforting environment you'd hope for. And yet somehow it worked often enough. Families kept growing, villages endured. Let's slide over to family size. Cold winters actually shaped how many children peasants had. Survival rates were lower in winter, so families had more children to hedge their bets. Harsh seasons kept populations in check, not by choice, but by attrition. Which sounds grim, but it was simply how life balanced itself out in a world without central heating, antibiotics, or, basic insulation. Now, let's talk about little innovations. Because peasants weren't passive victims of the cold, they got creative. One trick was the raised sleeping platform. Instead of putting beds directly on the floor, some cottages built wooden platforms or lofts. These kept sleepers away from drafts, closer to rising heat, and further from damp earth. In some places, entire families slept on wide platforms, mats of straw spread across them. Basically, a medieval bunk bed. Another small but clever trick was wall hangings. Peasants couldn't afford fancy tapestries like nobles, but they sometimes hung rough cloth or spare blankets on walls to cut down drafts. Even old cloaks nailed up made a difference, which is about as close as you get to medieval insulation and fireplaces. By the late Middle Ages, chimneys became more common. This changed everything. Instead of smoke drifting through the room and out the roof hole, it went up the chimney. That meant fires could burn hotter, beds could be closer, and houses became slightly more livable. Don't picture comfort, but picture fewer coughing fits in the middle of the night. Which honestly was progress. Let's float to diet again, because it was tied to warmth. We already mentioned leeks, onions and garlic, but there's another little detail: pottage. This was the staple peasant meal, basically a stew that simmered all day in a pot by the fire. Grains, beans, vegetable, sometimes meat if you had it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm, filling and easy to digest. Eating hot pottage before bed gave peasants a little inner warmth to survive the night. The medieval version of comfort food. And bread, always bread. Thick dark loaves of rye or barley bread sat heavy in the stomach, which was perfect for fueling long, cold sleeps. Pair that with weak ale and maybe a slice of cheese, and you had the medieval bedtime snack. Not exciting, but effective. Now, let's drift into the social side again, because cold nights brought people together in more ways than just sharing a bed. Families told stories, neighbours visited, villages gathered in larger halls for festivals or even just mutual warmth. Cold forced community, and community kept people sane. Imagine being trapped in a smoky hut with the same 5 people for 6 months. You'd go mad without outside contact. So winter evenings often meant shared time, games, songs, gossip. Here's a fun little tangent. Medieval games. In winter, peasants played dice, board games like Nine Men's Morris, and even simple card games once cards spread into Europe. Children played with wooden toys, bones, or just each other. Adults drank ale and told riddles. These weren't heated game nights with snacks. They were survival entertainment. Anything to pass the time until bed. Let's step into medicine again, because peasants weren't entirely clueless. Herbal remedies for cold were common. Sage, thyme, and rosemary were thought to strengthen the body. Hot drinks made with herbs or honey were prescribed for chills. If you had a cough, onion syrup or garlic wine was the go-to. Did they work? Maybe a little. At least they made you feel like you were doing something. And placebo warmth counts when your hut is freezing. Now, nobles again, because their innovations, ironically, trickled down. Wealthy households experimented with things like underfloor heating. Yes, really. The Romans had invented hypercourse systems centuries earlier, and a few medieval castles tried similar ideas. They weren't common, but the principle of channeling heat under floors existed. Peasants didn't get that luxury, but they did benefit when chimneys became widespread. That one noble innovation changed peasant life far more than a dozen fur cloaks ever did. Let's wander back to psychology. Cold nights shaped patience, but they also shaped spirituality. Winter was seen as a trial, a test from God. Surviving it was a sign of his mercy, which meant peasants didn't just fight the cold physically, they fought it mentally. Prayers before bed often included petitions for warmth, health, and protection. Sleep itself was framed as a little death, a nightly surrender, with the hope of waking to another day. And when you think about it, in a world that cold, every morning probably did feel like a small miracle. Now let's soften the gloom with a touch of humour. Because yes, medieval people joked about the cold too. Chroniclers mention villagers complaining that their ale froze before they could drink it, or that their chickens laid eggs harder than stone in winter. Exaggerations, sure, but proof that peasants laughed even while shivering. Cold wasn't just endured, it were mocked. Because sometimes the only way to stay warm is with a joke. And finally, picture this. A family settles in for the night. The father banks the fire with ash. The mother wraps the baby in cloth and tucks it close. The children huddle together, giggling at some whispered joke. Outside, the snow falls silently. Inside, there's smoke, straw, and the sound of breath. No one is comfortable, no one is warm, but together they survive. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough. In the next part, we'll drift further into how cold winters shaped peasant identity, how folklore around frost and winter spirits grew, and why even nobles never quite escaped the misery of freezing nights. So pull your blanket a little tighter, maybe close your eyes, and let's keep wandering. We've sat through smoky huts, starving winters, and even the Little Ice Age. But winter wasn't just practical misery, it was also imagination. Cold nights shaped folklore, stories, and myths, because when you're lying in the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, your mind wanders, and medieval minds wandered straight into the realm of spirits. Let's start with the personification of cold. Many villages imagined winter as a figure, sometimes a woman, sometimes a demon, sometimes both. In northern Europe, there were tales of a frost maiden or snow witch who brought ice storms and death. In other places, people blamed goblins or imps for stealing warmth. Did these figures exist? Of course not. But when your toes were numb and your breath was fogging inside the hut, blaming a frost spirit felt better than admitting your roof just leaked. England even had sayings about Jack Frost. Later traditions turned him into a cheeky sprite, but medieval peasants treated frost as something malicious, something that could creep in and kill crops, animals, or even babies. So people hung charms above beds, muttered prayers, or sprinkled holy water around doorways. None of it worked against cold, obviously, but it made them feel less helpless. Now, let's float into communal folklore. Winter was storytelling season. Families and neighbours gathered around the hearth, not because it was warm, it barely was, but because it was the only light. And out came the tales. Ghosts, saints, demons, fairies, stories about wolves with glowing eyes, or witches who rode storms. Many of the fairy tales we know today were shaped by those long dark nights, because nothing passes time like a spooky story when you can hear scratching in the rafters, and notice the themes: cold, hunger, survival, Hansel and Gretel wandering the snowy woods, the big bad wolf lurking near villages, fairies stealing food. All reflections of the same reality. Winter was hard. Stories made it manageable. Now, superstition and practice overlapped. Peasants believed certain days were especially dangerous in winter. The long nights around Christmas, for example, were thought to be full of spirits. Animals were believed to speak at midnight on Christmas Eve, though conveniently only if you weren't listening. Dreams at midwinter were considered prophetic. If you dreamed of warmth, it meant good fortune. If you dreamed of ice, it meant famine. Again, half psychology, half survival strategy. Dreams gave shape to anxieties. Let's drift back to nobles again, because even surrounded by fur and servants, they weren't free from superstition either. Royal courts were full of astrologers predicting how cold winters tied to planetary alignments. Kings hired physicians who warned against certain foods in winter, claiming they cooled the blood. Nobles wore amulets for warmth. Some even had relics of saints in their chambers, convinced holy bones would keep out the chill. So even the wealthy were, in a sense, shivering in the dark and whispering prayers to invisible forces. Now, another fun little detail. Animals in folklore. Because if you're sleeping with pigs and chickens, you're going to make up stories about them. Some villages believed cats could sense frost demons. Dogs were thought to protect families not just from wolves, but from spirits of the cold. And roosters crowing at odd hours in winter, definitely a sign. Of what? No one agreed. But definitely a sign. Let's pause for a moment on wolves, because nothing captures the medieval winter night quite like the howling of wolves outside a village. Wolves were real threats, hungry, bold, and unafraid to stalk livestock. Folklore painted them as symbols of winter itself, relentless, predatory, impossible to reason with. And while peasants huddled inside, they probably told stories of giant wolves, magical wolves, or cursed humans turned into wolves. Yes, werewolves. Winter and werewolves were basically inseparable in the medieval mind. Now, shift to community rituals. Cold nights brought people together for small but powerful traditions. Some villages lit communal bonfires on holy days, literally fighting darkness with flame. Others blessed candles at Candlemas, bringing them home as protection against storms and frost. And of course, there were prayers. Endless prayers. For warmth, for health, for spring. Religion wasn't separate from survival, it was survival. Faith kept people's minds warm when their bodies weren't. Let's slide back to peasants themselves, because this was their daily reality. Night after night, for months, the same routine. Stoking the embers, huddling together, pulling cloaks tight, ignoring the itch of straw. Sleep was rarely restful. You woke often to tend the fire, to shoe the animals, to quiet a child, to relieve yourself into the chamber pot. Cold interrupted everything, but routine kept you alive. And yet peasants didn't just endure, they adapted. Over generations they built habits, rituals, and a kind of psychological armour. They joked about the cold, they made stories about it, they turned survival into culture. That's why so many medieval songs and proverbs are about frost, fire, or winter patience. Because when you have nothing else, you survive with words. Now let's drift into a comparison one last time. Nobles versus peasants. Who had it worse? Nobles had more food, thicker blankets, and fancier fires. But castles were freezing. Drafts whistled through stone halls. Servants shivered in corners. Even kings slept under piles of furs. Their breath frosting in the air. Peasants, meanwhile, had small huts, smoky fires, and the warmth of the boughs. Neither side was comfortable. Neither side escaped the cold. The difference was that peasants accepted it as normal, while nobles complained endlessly in their chronicles. And here's the quiet irony. When you picture medieval life, it's easy to imagine romance, banquets, knights, tapestries. But the truth for both noble and peasant was much simpler. It was cold nights, endless cold nights. Layering, huddling, coughing, snoring, praying, itching, enduring. That was the real medieval experience. Everything else was details. So picture it again. Outside, wind, wolves and snow. Inside, straw, smoke and shared breath. Not a fairy tale, not a tragedy, just survival. In the next part, we'll close this long drift with the bigger legacy. How centuries of cold shaped medieval memory. Why people longed for warmth in both body and spirit. And how even today, our cosy beds are distant echoes of those freezing huts. So, take a breath, maybe close your eyes, and let's finish this slow journey through the cold medieval night. And yet peasants didn't just endure, they adapted. Over generations they built habits, rituals, and a kind of psychological armour. They joked about the cold, they made stories about it, they turned survival into culture. That's why so many medieval songs and proverbs are about frost, fire, or winter patience. Because when you have nothing else, you survive with words. Now let's drift into a comparison one last time. Nobles versus peasants. Who had it worse? Nobles had more food, thicker blankets, and fancier fires. But castles were freezing. Drafts whistled through stone halls. Servants shivered in corners. Even kings slept under piles of furs. Their breath frosting in the air. Peasants, meanwhile, had small huts, smoky fires, and the warmth of the boughs. Neither side was comfortable. Neither side escaped the cold. The difference was that peasants accepted it as normal, while nobles complained endlessly in their chronicles. And here's the quiet irony. When you picture medieval life, it's easy to imagine romance, banquets, knights, tapestries. But the truth for both noble and peasant was much simpler. It was cold nights, endless cold nights. Layering, huddling, coughing, snoring, praying, itching, enduring. That was the real medieval experience. Everything else was details. So picture it again. Outside, wind, wolves and snow. Inside, straw, smoke and shared breath. Not a fairy tale, not a tragedy, just survival. In the next part, we'll close this long drift with the bigger legacy. How centuries of cold-shaped medieval memory. Why people longed for warmth in both body and spirit. And how even today, our cozy beds are distant echoes of those freezing huts. So, take a breath, maybe close your eyes, and let's finish this slow journey through the cold medieval night.